62yo small village elder rapes a 16yo girl and forced her to marriage. 3 years later, she revenges. What if the person who destroyed your dreams became the one you were forced to call your husband? In a quiet, remote village in India, tradition governed every aspect of life. Yet, a young girl dared to dream beyond the limits set by her world. She pictured a life filled with learning and imagined herself rising above poverty to make her mark on the world. A world she had only glimpsed in stories. Her dreams were bright, filled with hope. But soon, those dreams would be set aside, replaced by something much darker. Something she never could have foreseen. In this village, one man held a position of high respect. He was an elder, a figure the community had trusted for years. Like everyone else, she knew him too. To the village, he represented wisdom and guidance. But for her, he would become something else entirely. When she sought protection, support, and love from her family and neighbors, she found only silence. That silence weighed on her, trapping her, stripping away even the faintest hope of escape. Alone in her thoughts, something began to shift within her. She had no voice to cry out, no path forward, only memories that haunted her and a resolve that grew stronger with each day. What happens when a girl with no way out decides to take control of her fate? In a small village far from city lights lived a 16-year-old girl named Rani. From a young age, Rani was known for her sharp mind and gentle spirit. She was the kind of girl who dreamed even during the day, her thoughts often drifting beyond the village boundaries. She saw herself walking through the gates of a university, carrying books, stepping into a life she had only imagined. To her, the world was vast, full of possibilities that could lift her far from the fields where she grew up and from the hard work that weighed down her family. But for Rani, dreams were luxuries. Her family relied on daily wages to survive. Her father, Mohan, worked under the scorching sun, breaking stones and carrying heavy loads, his hands marked by years of labor. Her mother, Lata, worked in nearby homes, sweeping floors and washing clothes, her back bent from their struggles. They earned just enough to put food on the table, but dreams of education, freedom, and change felt as distant as the stars above their village. Still, Rani clung to hope. Every night, after helping her mother with chores, she would sit by the dim lamp in their small home, poring over the few books she owned. She was bright. Her school teacher often told her parents that, with a chance, a mind like hers could go far. Her parents were proud, but also quietly anxious. How could they ever afford to send her away to study? How could they give her what they barely had themselves? It was during these years of silent struggle that Babu Lal, a respected 62-year-old elder of the village, began to visit their home more frequently. Babu Lal was a man who commanded respect without needing to ask for it. He was old, with silver hair and a stern, unyielding gaze. His voice held a weight that made villagers pause and listen. Over the years, he had carefully built a reputation as a problem solver, someone who helped resolve disputes and offered advice that many took as absolute truth. Sometimes he would even lend money to those in need. But behind this image of respect was a man who used his influence for his own benefit. To the outside world, Babu Lal was a guide, a man who stood for tradition and demanded obedience. Yet, in the quieter parts of the village, people whispered about his true nature. Beneath the surface, he was feared, even resented by those who had seen a darker side to his so-called generosity. Stories spread quietly, tales of debts that only grew, favors with hidden costs, and families who remained tied to him for generations. Many relied on him, but few truly trusted him. Bound by custom and fear, the villagers stayed silent, knowing that his reach went further than they could ever challenge. One day, Babu Lal visited Rani's family. He spoke to her father, Mohan, with a casual tone, discussing village matters, asking about the family's health, their work, their struggles. Grateful for the elder's attention, Mohan invited him in, nervously pouring a cup of tea, his hands trembling just a little. They talked for a long time, and though Mohan remained cautious, he couldn't help but feel comforted by Babu Lal's apparent concern. Here was a powerful man, someone who might, just might, be able to help them in ways they so desperately needed. As the weeks turned into months, Babu Lal's visits became more frequent. He would come by, saying he was simply checking in. Sometimes he'd bring small gifts, a sack of rice, a few coins, gestures that seemed thoughtful, even generous. Rani's parents accepted his help with gratitude, unaware that they were treading a path Babu Lal had carefully set before them. Over time, Babu Lal began speaking more directly about Rani. He praised her intelligence, her beauty, and commented on her future, as though it was his to shape. Rani noticed how his eyes lingered a bit too long, and a chill of discomfort ran through her. She shared her unease with her mother, Lata, but her mother dismissed it, thinking it was simply the elder's interest in her daughter's potential. In a village like theirs, respect wasn't a choice. It was expected. Lata had grown up honoring men like Babu Lal. Yet, Rani's unease only grew, until one day, in a moment she would replay in her mind for years to come, the elder's so-called kindness showed its true face. One quiet afternoon, Rani found herself alone at home. Her parents were out working, trying to earn enough to keep the family going, and her younger siblings had gone to visit relatives. The sun was high, casting shadows that danced along the clay walls of their simple home. Rani was busy with her chores, her mind drifting to dreams of school, of books, of a life where she could choose her own path. Lost in thought, she didn't hear the footsteps approaching the door. When Rani looked up, there he was, Babu Lal. His presence filled the small room, and the air suddenly felt thick and heavy. Rani's heart skipped a beat. She greeted him politely, with the respect she had been taught to show elders. He offered a small smile, one that didn't reach his eyes, and stepped further inside. His voice was low as he asked her about her family and the chores she was doing. Rani answered, glancing away, feeling a chill creep down her spine despite the afternoon heat. Then, Babu Lal's tone changed. His questions became personal, prying into matters that made Rani deeply uncomfortable. She tried to excuse herself, moving towards the door, but with a single step, he blocked her path. In that moment, the weight of his authority bore down on her. She looked up, her wide eyes searching his face, hoping to see some sign of the trusted elder the village respected. But all she found was a gaze as cold and unyielding as iron. Babu Lal moved closer, his shadow looming over her. A realization hit her, one that filled her with dread. She tried to back away, but he grabbed her arm, his hand rough and firm, holding her in place. Panic rose within her, her chest tightening as she desperately searched for a way to escape. But there was none. She was alone, powerless against a man who commanded respect from everyone around her, a man whose reputation shielded him from scrutiny. She felt trapped, her innocence helpless under the weight of his authority. Her quiet protests were swallowed by his overpowering presence. In those few, agonizing minutes, Rani's world shattered. Everything she had once believed in, the respect for elders, the trust in her community, and her dreams for a better life was torn away. Her innocence was stolen, and she was left paralyzed by shock and fear, burdened by a trauma she couldn't even begin to express. She lay there, staring blankly at the ceiling, feeling numbness seep over her like a dark cloud. The warm light of the afternoon seemed to mock her, casting a harsh glare on the emptiness she now felt inside. Days passed in a daze. Rani tried to carry on, to piece together the remnants of her life, but shame, confusion, and anger consumed her. She couldn't shake the feeling that everyone knew, that the walls of her village had seen her suffering and stayed silent. Her world felt unfamiliar, her dreams like distant memories, replaced by a reality she couldn't escape. Soon, she began to feel changes in her body that confirmed the painful truth she had tried to deny. The nausea, exhaustion, and other signs were all there, pointing to one devastating reality. She was carrying the child of the man who had ruined her life. The news spread quickly, and soon the quiet whispers in the village turned to louder voices of outrage and condemnation. The villagers could no longer ignore what had happened. One of their own, a young girl, had been violated, and Babu Lal, the man they respected and looked up to, had committed an act so disgraceful that even the other elders began to question his character. Babu Lal was arrested, his authority suddenly stripped away, leaving the undeniable truth of his actions exposed. The village was divided. Some were shocked and rallied to support Rani, but many others hesitated, uneasy about holding someone as powerful as Babu Lal accountable. For Rani, the arrest brought a brief flicker of hope. A hope that perhaps justice was within reach, that maybe, just maybe, she could find a small piece of peace. But this hope was short-lived. Babu Lal's influence ran deep, and it didn't take long for the pressures to start weighing on her family. Poor and vulnerable, her parents felt the weight of the whispers and the glances from neighbors who expected them to handle the matter quietly. Friends and relatives urged them to think of their survival, to consider the cost of opposing a man as powerful as Babu Lal. Rani watched as her family's resolve crumbled under the growing pressure. Her father, Mohan, who had once demanded justice, began to waver. His voice grew quieter, and he avoided meeting her gaze. Her mother, Lata, who had once promised her that justice would be served, now spoke in hushed tones, telling her that they must think of the family, that this battle might cost them more than they could bear. They were poor, after all, without resources, without allies, and dependent on the goodwill of the very people who had now turned away. With each passing day, Rani's hope faded. She began to realize that, in her world, justice was reserved only for those with power and influence. She was merely a young girl, a girl who had dared to dream beyond her means, and now she was paying the price. The villagers who once whispered their sympathy grew silent, either out of fear or loyalty to Babu Lal. Even the women, those who might have understood her pain, looked away, unwilling to challenge the man who held so much power. In the end, Babu Lal was released. He returned to the village with a smug look of assurance, as though he were untouchable, as though he had survived the storm without a single scratch. The respect he once commanded had faded, but it was replaced by a quiet fear, and fear served him just as well. He still held power over the village, over Rani's family, and over her life. For Rani, his release shattered whatever small illusions she had left of justice, of a world where right could triumph over wrong. She was forced to watch him walk free, to see him carry on as if nothing had happened. She had to bear the weight of a decision not made by her, but forced upon her, a decision that condemned her to a life of shame, isolation, and silence. Babu Lal's release cast a heavy shadow over Rani's family. Mohan and Lata felt the burden of their daughter's plight, but they were bound by poverty and the unspoken rules of their village. They had no resources to stand against Babu Lal's power, no way to escape the whispers and stares that followed them wherever they went. Each day, they heard neighbors murmuring that Rani's presence, young, pregnant, and unwed, would only bring shame upon their family. As Rani's pregnancy became more obvious, her family's desperation grew. Mohan and Lata were already struggling. Their daily work barely provided enough food for the table, and now, with another mouth to feed, the strain felt unbearable. They worried about how they would care for a daughter who, in the village's judgment, was now seen as ruined. The cost of supporting her and the unborn child loomed over them, and the only answer that seemed to quiet the pressing voices around them was a marriage, even to the man who had caused her suffering. Mohan tried to convince himself that this choice might secure Rani's future, offering her some stability in a society that had already turned its back on her. Lata told herself that, with Babu Lal's means, at least Rani and her child wouldn't go hungry. The reality was much harsher. They simply couldn't afford to support her and the child. They had nothing left to offer, and the pressure to avoid disgrace weighed on them like an iron shackle. So, surrendering to fear and scarcity, they agreed to marry Rani to the elder, convincing themselves that at the very least, this would save her from a lifetime of social judgment, and spare them from economic ruin. On her wedding day, Rani, just 16 years old, walked down the path to a new life with a heart full of sorrow and betrayal. She felt abandoned by those who should have protected her, condemned by the very hands that should have lifted her up. The village watched in silence, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and satisfaction, as if this ceremony could somehow erase the past and restore order to their world. But to Rani, this was a betrayal beyond words, a final act that forced her to submit to the man who had shattered her dreams. Life with Babu Lal was nothing like her parents had imagined. He saw her not as a partner or even as the mother of his child, but as a possession. He showed no tenderness, only control, treating her as if her will, her body, and her very existence belonged solely to him. Every day, he reminded her of her place, expecting obedience without question and demanding service without complaint. Rani's days became an endless cycle of duty, silence, and pain. When her first child, a baby girl, was born, Rani felt a flicker of joy, a sense of purpose as she cradled her newborn in her arms. But that joy was quickly overshadowed by Babu Lal's indifference. He saw no value in a daughter, considering her just another burden he ignored, a mouth he had no interest in feeding. Rani was left to care for the child alone, scraping together what little she could to make sure the baby had enough. Over time, Rani's health began to decline. Worn out and exhausted, she struggled constantly to care for her child under Babu Lal's constant neglect. And as if to remind her of her helplessness, she soon found herself pregnant again. Her second pregnancy was even harder on her weakened body. But Babu Lal showed no concern for her or the child she carried. He left her to manage, to cope, to endure, as if her well-being was an afterthought. In those long, silent hours, Rani's resentment deepened as she watched each day slip further from the life she had once dreamed of. Rani watched as the life she had once dreamed of, one filled with education, choices, and love, faded further with each passing day. She saw the way Babu Lal looked at her, his eyes holding no warmth, only the demand for her silent obedience. She felt the weight of her parents' decision and the suffocating reality of their poverty, which had bound her to this man. With every act of neglect and every reminder of what she had lost, her sorrow transformed into something sharper. A quiet, simmering hatred began to take root in her heart, growing stronger day by day. Her dreams of happiness had been extinguished, replaced by the grim certainty that her life would always be chained to the man who treated her as nothing more than an object. Yet, beneath the silence and the dutiful mask she wore, her spirit remained unbroken. Her heart had become a furnace of resentment. In the depths of her suffering, she vowed to herself that one day she would reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Years passed in a heavy, unspoken silence, and Rani grew more distant from the life she once knew. She felt like a stranger in her own body, her own home, and even her own village. Friends she once laughed with now avoided her, their faces clouded with pity or silent judgment. Her family, though nearby, felt worlds away, bound by a fragile peace they had bought at the cost of her freedom. The dreams she once held of studying, of walking the grounds of a university, of building a life filled with choice and love, became ghosts that haunted her at night, disappearing with the first light of dawn. Rani was alone. Her days were spent in silence, tending to her children, enduring Babu Lal's cold presence and his constant reminders of her submission. Her life felt less like a marriage and more like a sentence. She was isolated, her voice lost, her heart a hollow echo of the girl she had once been. Each night, as she lay in the darkness, she felt the weight of her sorrow pressing down, threatening to consume her. She felt suffocated by the life she had been forced into, the walls of her reality closing in around her, with no one to understand her pain and no one to share the burden of her suffering. But as the years went on, something within Rani began to change. It was small at first, a quiet rebellion in her heart that went unnoticed by those around her. She found herself unable to endure Babu Lal's commands with the same silent acceptance. Her gaze, once always cast down, began to lift, meeting his eyes with a defiance simmering just beneath the surface. When he ordered her to serve him, she would take an extra moment, letting her silence linger, her stillness quietly challenging his authority. She started to resist in small, nearly invisible ways. A slight pause, a look that conveyed more than words ever could, a refusal to cower under his gaze. To anyone else, these were minor actions, almost meaningless. But to Rani, they were victories, moments where she began to reclaim the control that had been stripped from her. She would meet his eyes, her expression giving away nothing of the obedience he expected. Rani moved through the house with a new sense of purpose. Her actions were slow, deliberate, each one a quiet reminder to herself that she was not yet defeated, that her spirit had not been broken. But with each small act of defiance, her resentment grew. She began to see Babu Lal not as an elder, not as her husband, but as the embodiment of everything that had been stolen from her. He was the reason her dreams had been taken, the reason she was isolated from the people she loved, the reason her life had become a hollow imitation of what it should have been. The hatred she felt for him was like a seed planted deep within her soul, growing stronger with each passing day, each slight, and each reminder of her lost freedom. Some days it felt as though she could bear no more. She would stare out the small window of her home, watching the world she had once seen as full of promise slip further and further away. Rani realized that there was no escape, no future beyond the walls of her marriage, no chance of reclaiming the life she had lost. Her parents had turned a blind eye to her suffering, her village had cast its judgment, and she was left with only the cold certainty that her life would end as it had begun, bound, silent, and unseen. In the quiet of those endless days, Rani's mind began to drift toward darker thoughts. She imagined a world without Babu Lal, a world where she could be free from his shadow, from the suffocating control he held over her. She pictured the life she could have led if he had never come into it, the paths she might have taken if he hadn't stolen everything from her. With these thoughts came a new understanding, a realization that perhaps her only way out was through him. Her resentment hardened, transforming into something more powerful, more dangerous. She no longer wished for a life of quiet rebellion or passive resistance. She wanted freedom, true freedom, and she knew that the only way to achieve it was to rid herself of the man who had become her prison. Her thoughts turned to revenge, her heart growing colder with each passing day, each glance, each command he issued, expecting her submission. In the stillness of her mind, Rani's plan began to take shape. She waited, biding her time, her every action measured, her every glance hiding the storm that brewed within her. Her hatred, once a silent companion, became her driving force, guiding her through each day with a single, unwavering purpose. Though she continued to move through her life as Babu Lal expected, silent, obedient, bound, there was a glint in her eye, a spark in her heart, a hidden strength that lay just beneath the surface, waiting. Rani was no longer the helpless girl he had once overpowered. She was a woman forged in the fires of suffering, a woman who had tasted betrayal, a woman who had been pushed to the edge of her endurance. And she was ready to reclaim the life he had stolen, ready to break free from the chains he had bound her with, ready to take back the control she had lost. In her silence, she plotted, her hatred feeding the resolve that had grown within her. The hatred within Rani had fed a deep resolve, one that would one day find its release. Finally, the night she had been waiting for arrived. She moved through the shadows of her home with silent purpose, each step carefully placed, every movement measured. The day had unfolded like any other, but there was an eerie calm about her, a stillness that felt like a veil. She had watched Babu Lal's every move, noting the times he sat, when he ate, and when he finally retreated to his room for the night. Her resolve was firm, her plan clear, her heart steady in the silence that surrounded her. She had prepared everything down to the smallest detail. The children were tucked away, fast asleep, their tiny breaths soft and even. She lingered by their doorway for a moment, her eyes tracing the lines of their peaceful faces, their innocence untouched by the pain she bore. For an instant, her gaze softened, a fleeting moment of love for the lives she had protected in the only way she knew how. But her heart hardened again as she turned away, her mind returning to the task that lay before her. Rani made her way to the kitchen, moving swiftly and precisely. She reached for the handle of the knife, feeling its weight in her hand, the cool metal a stark contrast to the fire that burned within her. She held it steady, her grip tightening as she remembered every insult, every touch, every stolen moment of happiness. Her body was still, her breathing calm, her mind as sharp as the blade she held. This was the night that would change everything. She felt no fear, no hesitation, only a cold certainty that had been forged in the years of torment she had endured. The house was quiet, cloaked in darkness. As she moved toward the room where Babu Lal slept, she paused at the doorway, her silhouette barely visible in the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the window. She could see him lying there, oblivious, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Each breath he took seemed to mock her, a reminder of the control he had held over her life for so long. But tonight, he would breathe his last as a free man. She stepped forward, her bare feet silent against the floor. Her gaze was fixed on him, her eyes cold, detached, her heart a fortress of hatred. She raised the knife, the metal catching a glint of the moonlight as she positioned herself beside him. There was no hesitation, no tremor in her hand. Years of bottled-up rage, years of suffering, years of silence, all converged into this single moment. With a calm, calculated movement, she brought the knife down, the blade piercing flesh, cutting through the darkness. Her expression remained unchanged, her breathing steady, her eyes hard and unblinking as she struck again, and again and again. Each motion was deliberate, each strike a release, each thrust driven by the pain, the anger, the sorrow that had lived within her for so long. Her hand moved with precision, her grip unwavering, as though she was finally taking control of her life, one cut at a time. The room was filled with silence, save for the faint sound of Rani's steady, deliberate breaths. With each movement, the weight of the years and the burden of her suffering seemed to lift. Her body felt lighter, and, for the first time, her heart felt at peace. She stood over him, her eyes empty of pity, her mind clear. She had reclaimed what he had stolen from her, her peace, bit by bit, with every act of vengeance that had built up within her soul. The stillness in the room held a quiet intensity, the air thick with the finality of what she had done. As she looked down at him lying motionless, a realization washed over her. She was free. The man who had haunted her days, tormented her nights, and bound her life to his was gone. In that moment, Ronnie was no longer his captive, no longer his possession. She was herself once again, a woman who had taken back her life, who had broken free from the chains that had kept her in silence. She took a step back, her breathing calm, her heart steady, feeling the weight of her past finally fall away. The house was quiet, the world outside untouched by the violence that had unfolded within these walls. As the first light of dawn began to touch the edges of the sky, Ronnie turned, leaving behind the shadows of her old life and stepping forward into a future that, for the first time, was truly her own. The dawn broke quietly over the village, a soft light spilling over rooftops and casting gentle shadows along the narrow pathways. But inside Babu Lal's home, the air was thick with an unnatural silence, a stillness that clung to the walls. It wasn't until later that morning, when neighbors gathered for their usual routines, that they began to sense something was wrong. A young boy, sent to call on Babu Lal for an early meeting, knocked on the door, his small hand hesitating as the quiet inside felt strange, unsettling. Receiving no answer, he pushed open the door, his eyes widening as he saw the elder lying still. A lifeless, eerie stillness in his once commanding form. Panic spread through him, and within moments, word had traveled across the village like wildfire. Villagers crowded around Babu Lal's home, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Some stood in silence, hands over their mouths, while others murmured, their eyes darting from face to face, searching for answers. For a man of such stature, a man who had been respected, even feared, this was unthinkable. The elder who had shaped the lives of so many now lay lifeless, his final hours shrouded in mystery. As whispers grew, some began to piece together fragments of what they knew about Babu Lal's life, especially his recent years with Ronnie. Villagers had always spoken quietly, in hushed tones, about the nature of his relationship with her and the circumstances that had led her into his household. They knew of her suffering, her quiet obedience, the way she had always seemed to live under a shadow. For the first time, some dared to voice what they had long suspected, that perhaps this was no accident, that perhaps the man who had wielded so much power over Ronnie's life had finally met his end at her hands. Yet, not everyone was so understanding. As the days passed and the initial shock began to wear off, sides began to form within the village. Some spoke in whispers, saying that Babu Lal had brought this fate upon himself, that his actions had finally caught up with him. They murmured that Ronnie had been a victim, forced into a life of submission and silence, and that perhaps this was her way of reclaiming the life she had been denied. But others, those who had benefited from Babu Lal's influence, those who saw tradition and respect as untouchable pillars, were horrified. To them, she was a criminal, a woman who had committed an unspeakable act, no matter her circumstances. When the authorities arrived, the investigation began, methodical and cold. They combed through the house, piecing together evidence that would inevitably lead them to Ronnie. Bloodstains traced a path, fingerprints marked where she had steadied herself, each trace a silent testament to the night she had waited years to confront. Ronnie did not flee, nor did she resist. She stood with a calm that unsettled the villagers, her expression unreadable as they questioned her. Her answers were quiet, yet unflinching. When asked about her motives, she did not hide the truth. She spoke plainly, recounting years of torment, stolen dreams, and the quiet resentment that had grown into something far stronger. Her words were steady, each one revealing the layers of her suffering. She spoke not as a criminal, but as a woman who had endured too much, a woman stripped of everything until only her resolve remained. The legal proceedings that followed were complex, a tangled struggle of tradition, authority, and justice in a place where such matters were rarely questioned. The village elders, some of whom had once revered Babu Lal, found themselves struggling to reconcile the man they had known with the dark truths emerging from Ronnie's testimony. They heard of the abuse, the forced marriage, the isolation that had bound her for years, and yet, the idea of a woman taking justice into her own hands unsettled them. Tradition held weight, and Babu Lal, even in death, seemed to wield a power that was hard to let go of. The courtroom itself became a battleground for ideals, a clash between loyalty to tradition and the pursuit of justice. Some village elders spoke on her behalf, detailing the life she had led, the way she had been trapped, the years of mistreatment. Others condemned her, their voices sharp with disapproval, claiming that her actions had shattered the very fabric of their community. They argued that, despite her suffering, she had broken an unspoken law, a law that forbade anyone from challenging their place in the social order. Outside, villagers gathered, listening to the echoes of the trial as they carried through the crowded room. Each word sparked fresh debates, dividing friends and families as they argued over what was right and what was wrong. Some said she deserved freedom, that she was more than justified in her actions. Some villagers believed Rani was justified in ending the life of the man who had stolen hers, saying she had simply reclaimed what he had taken from her. Others argued that she had gone too far, that vengeance could never be excused, no matter how deeply she had been hurt. Through it all, Rani remained silent, her gaze steady, her face a mask of calm as the trial dragged on. Each day filled with testimonies, arguments, and pleas. Rani had told her story. There was nothing more to add. Her motives were clear, her suffering laid bare before those who had ignored it for years. She did not beg for mercy, nor did she try to justify herself beyond the truth she had spoken. In that small courtroom, under the scrutinizing eyes of villagers and authorities alike, Rani's story became a test of justice itself. The village was forced to confront its own values, its treatment of women, its loyalty to powerful figures. For some, Rani's actions served as a mirror, reflecting the flaws and hidden darkness within their traditions. For others, she became a symbol of rebellion, a woman who had finally taken back control in a world that had long denied it to her. The villagers held their breath as the judge read the final verdict. It was a decision that had been weighed heavily, one that considered every angle, tradition versus justice, authority versus compassion. They knew that, whatever the outcome, it would echo through their small community, leaving a mark that could not be erased. Rani was sentenced to 15 years in confinement, a decision that walked a fine line between punishment and understanding. The judge acknowledged her suffering, the years of entrapment, and the torment that had driven her to take such drastic action. It was clear he saw her not as a common criminal, but as a woman who had been pushed beyond the boundaries of human endurance. The villagers reacted in different ways. Some were quietly outraged, unable to reconcile the leniency with their rigid sense of justice. Others, particularly those who had long sympathized with Rani, felt a bittersweet relief. Yes, she would face time behind bars, but there was an understanding that she was more than her actions, that her suffering had not gone unnoticed. As Rani was led away, her gaze remained steady, her heart carrying the weight of both freedom and consequence. She knew that her sentence was a shadow compared to the years she had already endured. In those moments, she felt perhaps, for the first time, a sense of liberation, as though the walls that had confined her for so long had finally fallen away. As Rani's story lingered in the minds of the villagers and beyond, it raised questions that could not easily be put to rest. Could this tragedy have been avoided if her family had been met with compassion instead of judgment? If cries for help had not fallen on deaf ears, would Rani's life have taken a different path? Her family's requests for financial aid from the local administration had been ignored. They were desperate, bound by a poverty that drove them to unimaginable choices. Yet, was that desperation enough to justify marrying their daughter to the very man who had destroyed her life? The village remains divided. Some look at Rani and see a tragic figure, a woman who suffered quietly until she could endure no more. They understand that her actions were born from years of trauma and betrayal, the culmination of pain and deep psychological scars inflicted upon her. They view her as a product of a system that allowed her abuse, a system that turned its back on her suffering. To them, she is not a murderer but a symbol of a broken world. Others, however, cannot look past her final act. They see only the violence of that night and condemn her as a criminal. They question if desperation can truly excuse what she did, struggling with the idea that she crossed a sacred line by taking a life. For them, her actions represent a break in tradition, a betrayal of values they hold, no matter her suffering. The moral ambiguity of Rani's story reaches deeper than any single judgment could capture. Was her action justified? Can anyone truly understand the depths of her trauma and despair? The lines between victim and perpetrator blur, leaving everyone to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that sometimes justice is neither simple nor absolute. The village has changed, and the echoes of Rani's story ripple through the lives of everyone who witnessed it. The consequences of unchecked authority, the silent acceptance of abuse, and the societal indifference that forced her into silence have all woven together to create a tragedy that now reflects the world around her. And so we are left with questions. When does self-defense become justice, and when does it cross into crime? Could Rani's suffering have been prevented if poverty hadn't silenced her family? If her community had found shame in allowing their daughter to be given to a man who abused her? If she had been supported? If the pain she endured had been acknowledged? Would she have been driven to such an end? Should justice demand that victims suffer further under the guise of tradition? In the end, Rani's story reminds us that the scars of trauma run deep and that no one should be left alone to bear the weight of abuse. There should be no forgiveness for those who destroy lives with impunity. When society turns a blind eye, when families are forced into choices no one should have to make, lives unravel, and tragedy becomes inevitable. Please subscribe to stay with us for stories that explore the complexities of justice, resilience, and survival.